Hello, we're going to go over a little bit about probability today. We'll talk a little bit about some vocab as well as how to calculate probability. So, what's a probability experiment? An experiment just means what are we going to do in order to collect our data. So, an example would be rolling a die and observing the number that shows up. So I've got six possibilities, and these possibilities are called outcomes. When I roll my die one time, the outcome of that one roll is considered an outcome. And the sample space then is just a list of all the possible things that could happen. Typically, we put our sample space in curly braces. Here's three different experiments. Toss a coin one time, roll a die one time, take a test where my only options are pass, fail, and there's a list of all the outcomes, and we put our list of all the outcomes in a sample space. So S stands for sample space. S equals heads, tails, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or PF for pass, fail. Now, a tree diagram is a visual representation of our experiment. So it's really good for seeing what all the possibilities are. In this tree diagram, the purple represents answering a true-false question. So our possible answers are true-false. So each possibility gets its own branch. And then our multiple choice question comes after our true-false question, and there's 5 choices there. So a tree diagram is more of a what if I do this and then what? So what if I answer true and then what? Well, then what would be I would pick one of the answers A through E. And if you notice over here on this side list here, that's a listing of all the possibilities, all of the outcomes. So there's 10 different outcomes. I can find that number fairly easily by taking the 2 choices from the 2 true false times the 5 choices for the multiple choice. That tells me there's 10 different possible outcomes. Now to toss a coin twice, I could make what's called a Venn diagram. I don't think much of the Venn diagram, but I could get a heads or I could get a tails. On the other hand, and I forgot, I'm tossing the coin twice. So heads, 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 tails. Those are all the possibility with getting heads first. Or I could get tails, heads, and then tails, tails. Now with a Venn diagram, the first toss of a coin gets its own set of branches. So I could get a heads or I could get a tails. Now what if I get a heads? Then I flip the coin again and I could get a heads or I could get a tails. But what if I got a tails on the first go around? Then what? Then I could get a heads on the second flip or a tails on the first flip. And then my outcomes would be heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, and tails, tails. So I've got 4 outcomes, and then my sample space would just be a listing of those 4 outcomes. So if you don't understand what outcomes are, if you don't understand how to come up with a sample space, you need to be asking questions to get that straightened up. Now, an event just means what's one thing that could happen. So if I roll a die, what are the things that could happen? Well, I'm going to say that event A is rolling an even number. So I'm going to talk about the probability of event A occurring, and what I'm speaking about is the probability that I would get an even number. So the probability of